CrimeCon, the world's #1 true crime event, is launching in Glasgow for 2022 on the 10th of September. Get inside the mind of serial killers and psychopaths. Learn from leading criminologists, hear from the families and survivors, meet your favorite true crime podcasters, immerse yourself in forensic evidence, and delve deeper into unsolved crimes. CrimeCon is the ultimate true crime experience, partnered by CBS Reality, the expert-led true crime TV channel. What's Up Doc will be there, so come and join me. Quote, What's Up for your special 10% discount off your ticket. Limited tickets are on sale now. For more information, visit crimecon.co.uk or whatsupdocpodcast.com. Hi guys, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed episode 1. We took live from CrimeCon UK 2022 in London. It was an amazing experience, and I was joined, of course, by the irreplaceable Colin Sutton. What a legend, what a gentleman, and it was really, really fun experience. So we're back for episode 2, and I'm really excited to be joined by Kacey from the Cult Vault. It's a podcast specializing in all things culty, and of course, I met her at CrimeCon and I said, you know what we have to do? We have to do a review of Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, the new Netflix documentary. And she graciously accepted. So this is it. This is myself and Kacey's little chat. We sat down, talked about the documentary itself, and then just on the wider spectrum, cults, and Kacey imparted some of her expertise onto me. Hope you enjoy it. Kacey, from the Cult Vault, you are very, very welcome to What's Up Doc.
Thank you so much, Gemma, for having me. I'm really excited to be able to connect now that there are a few things coming out that bring our two platforms together. So Thank you so much for having me today.
Not at all, not at all. I first of all have to tell the story of how we met. So we met the first night of CrimeCon UK. You were scuttered and I was scuttered. And then you told me what your podcast was about, the Cult Vault, obviously, about cults. And I was like, oh my God, have you seen this documentary? You have to come on my show and we have to discuss it. And the rest is history.
Yeah. And that was that. Yeah. And that's how it happened. And if anyone's wondering what CrimeCon's like, that's literally it. You've just encapsulated it. Every single conversation you have, it's, oh my goodness, let's collaborate. And that's what the whole weekend is.
Yeah. Pretty much. And it was a real bonding experience as well, because obviously I've talked about this on Instagram already on my stories and stuff. The hotel went on fire. We had pretty much no electricity for the weekend. It was like heading for 30 degrees. We had no showers. It was like being at a music festival. So we just drank pretty much for the whole weekend.
We did. And it's so weird because I was saying this to my partner when we got back. Usually that sort of environment would really stress me out, sort of having a schedule and then not being able to stick to it, and then not really knowing what was happening because the hotel couldn't tell us anything. And usually that sort of thing I think would really get to me, but we just carried on drinking, and I think we all just pretended that everything was normal and there was nothing troopers. Wrong.
We're such professionals.
And I woke up on the Monday with no voice. I had COVID, and I was just like, what happened?
It really was. It was like a music festival. It was crazy. But look, the documentary in question that I was talking about was Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. It's the recent release on Netflix by Rachel Dretson. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. She is the creative mind behind Who Killed Malcolm X. I'm not sure if you've seen that documentary. It's another cracking one if you're looking for some recommendations, Kacey. And look, she's won Emmys and Peabody Awards. Like, this is not her first rodeo. She's a pro, and I think it shows.
Yeah, I actually was looking at the on the Internet Movie Database page earlier, and there was a second director credited called Grace McNally, and actually she was involved in The Vow, which is a documentary about NXIVM.
Yes.
So anybody listening that's familiar with cults and coercion will know that NXIVM is a group that has been labelled a cult and has been in the news quite a lot recently. because of the leader being sentenced to 120 years, which we don't really tend to see with cult leaders.
Crazy.
So pretty historical moment. So so this person was involved in the vow. So I wonder if McNally was brought in as maybe like an expert for looking into this type of thing.
I would imagine so. Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. That has to have been the reason behind the collaboration. And that's a cracking documentary as well. If you haven't seen it, oh my God, it's crazy, but it's a really good watch.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like, I mean, she's, like I said, it's not her first rodeo. She is a professional in this regard. But I suppose like the FLDS, I think I said to you that drunken night we met, that like I read a book, and I mean, I was probably my daughter's age or maybe a little bit younger. I was somewhere between 15 to 17 kind of reading this book. A friend gave it to me and I'd never heard of them before that. This big, thick book, you know, before the internet, there was no way of Googling anything. And I mean, I sat down and I read that cover to cover. I could not believe what I was reading. And this, again, like I said, you know, I'm probably 15, 16 or 17, no knowledge of like the Mormon church or the outbreaks of the Mormon church, you know, living here in little Catholic Ireland, you know, population less than 5 million. I'd never heard the likes of it. And I remember just being like glued to the book. So when was the first time you heard about the FLDS?
Well, I have interviewed a few individuals recently. So for anyone that hasn't heard of the Cult Vault podcast, it's a long format interview based podcast where I speak to a different cult survivor each week. So every Friday a new episode comes out. And actually recently I have done a couple of episodes on the LDS Church. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So if you think of Mormon faith, Mormonism, or you know, the Mormon faith as an umbrella, there are various branches that come off of that umbrella. And the LDS Church is one of them. And the FLDS Church is the other. So in terms of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the FLDS Church, I have looked into them separate from the podcast because I was really interested in Warren Jeffs as a figure and leader of the FLDS Church when he himself was arrested and charged, because as we were just talking about before, it's not often that happens. And actually a lot of polygamy in certain parts of America, even though it's illegal, plural marriage, it does still happen because there are a lot of people from law enforcement involved in plural marriages, as we might talk about, we saw in the documentary, which was quite interesting itself. So I kind of stumbled across the subject a couple of years ago, but only recently through these interviews with survivors of the LDS Church have I actually had an opportunity to understand the subject a little bit clearer.
I mean, moving on from that then, it's a nice little segue. What do you think is the purpose of this documentary? What's the message that the director is trying to get across, or the story that they're trying to tell?
I think it's a really difficult question to answer, and I was trying to consider that during the watch through of the documentary, because episode 1 kind of felt like an introduction to the women in the church, and then it quickly went on to Rulon Jeffs and then talked about his son Warren Jeffs, and then the second episode was kind of where I guess people might say kind of the craziness that really started to unveil, you know, things that we wouldn't see typically in everyday life started to become apparent sort of from episode 2 onwards. So I was kind of wondering, was it to highlight Warren Jeffs as an individual, how he managed to build his empire and how he was taken down? Because the last sort of 5 to 10 minutes of the documentary were all of these women that had been through these horrible, abusive, traumatic experiences, who basically just said, like, now I have to rebuild my entire life from scratch because I was born into this group and I don't know anything outside of it. And that was the end of the documentary, you know? So when I speak to people, there'll be a good portion of each conversation that focuses on life after their involvement in a group or high demand religious group. And I don't know, it kind of just felt like, you know, loads about Warren Jeffs, and then it ended. So maybe that was the point of it, just to highlight him as an individual. I mean, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I was kind of the same, to be honest with you. It reminded me, even though there was 4 parts, as you said, it kind of nearly reminded me of, you know, the 3-act structure within a play. You know, where you introduce the world, you know, the everyday life, as they call it, and then you have what's called the inciting incident, and that's, you know, what turns the whole world upside down. And I think there was a definite effort in the first episode to kind of go, everything was sweetness and light, you know, before Warren Jeffs came along. And I'm not sure if that, you know, I suppose from their reality, from their point of view, they were like, oh, it wasn't so bad. But I guess me coming from, you know, a culture where, all right, we were controlled by a religious group to some degree. I don't know whether you call it a cult, whether it would be classified as cult status. But obviously, like, the history of the Catholic Church in Ireland is huge. Like, you know, there definitely was a culty element there. But yeah, still, having come from that environment, I suppose I was looking at it kind of going, can you ever really say things were sweetness and light if you were, you know, restricted from the outside world?
Yep.
If your education was restricted, if you were subservient to men, if, you know, part of your religious belief, whether you wanted to or not, you had to allow your husband to have multiple wives. So I was kind of like, yeah, there was an effort there definitely to go, it was all lovely before. And I'm like,
Yeah, I agree. And I actually had that in my notes. I wonder if the reason, you know, when you picked up that big heavy book and you weren't able to put it down, I wonder if it's because you were able to draw parallels between your experiences and knowledge of growing up in that particular part of Ireland and the Catholic Church and the FLDS movement, because on paper they probably look, you know, quite similar. If you took away the title of the particular religious movement that you were talking about and just wrote down, you know, some methods of control that are used within those groups, it actually might be quite difficult to differentiate between the two.
Yeah.
But I haven't done it. So if anybody wants to do it and challenge me on that, I'd love to have that conversation. But I actually wrote down a quote here that from a number of the women who were speaking. And one of them said, "We believed Rulon Jeffs would never die. He would be renewed young. He knew all of our thoughts, dreams, wishes." So again, you know, that is what we might call like a mystic, somebody with mystical knowledge. And that is because everybody in the group, there'll be a self-policing surveillance system where everybody feeds everything back up the hierarchy to the leadership. So the leadership knows absolutely everything going on. And then they'll come to you and say, "Oh my goodness, I feel like you might be worried about money." And the person's like, "Wow, you're so knowledgeable. How did you know this?" And it really does emphasize, you know, him as a prophet, which I obviously put in air quotes. Rulon Jeffs as a prophet, self-proclaimed. He is actually creating that environment where people buy into that rhetoric and that idea. And you are absolutely right. If you go all the way back to Joseph Smith, there are accounts or stories of him having child brides, and of Joseph Smith conducting arranged marriages and plural marriages. And there's supposed accounts of child abuse. So even all the way back to the founder of the Mormon faith itself, in Joseph Smith, there are problematic themes. And you can see, exactly as you said, Gemma, those same problematic issues that existed with Rulon Jeffs before Warren Jeffs took over. Warren Jeffs was just very clever at introducing that fire and brimstone doomsday rhetoric that had everybody scared. So now you're not only controlling where people live and their finances and who they marry and who they divorce and who their kids spend time with and their education, all of those things that you mentioned. You're not only controlling that, you're controlling people's emotions when you tell them that if they don't have a certain amount of wives, and by the way, only I can tell you who you can marry.
Yes. Oh my God.
Then you will never reach this celestial kingdom. And that's where the problem is. because people are then fearful of their eternal souls. And that is a real thing that I think people outside of high demand religious groups struggle to understand, because we haven't been in those self-sealing, insular environments where that is all you are told day in, day out.
Yeah.
You know, that heaven exists. It is a kingdom that we can reach if we do what the leader says. So, Pete, you know, and some of the women talked about it. They were too scared to leave because they were worried about their eternal souls. And that's a very real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I suppose for anybody who's not familiar with the FLDS church and what their kind of religious beliefs are, I am by no means an expert, but I mean, by the reckoning of the documentary, in the briefest of synopsises, it is a polygamous branch of the Mormon church. But also they're kind of, you know, there's nearly an Amish, you know, element to it in the fact that, you know, they're controlled in the way they dress. They have to wear very modest clothing, you know, long underwear. Their hair has to be in one of 3 or 4 different styles. Like you said, they're told by the prophet, the head of the church, who they can marry. It's all arranged marriages. And then in the religion as well, if you don't have 3 wives, you will not reach everlasting life. And like you said, the prophet is the one who decides who gets the 3 wives and who doesn't. So like the name of the documentary, Keep Sweet, they're all keeping sweet because they all want to keep them on side, because if not, they're going to die. And like you said as well, you know, it's the elements are always there before the bad guy comes in. And again, I put him in inverted commas. But the first episode is really about the FLDS under the rulership of Rulon Jeffs.
Yep.
And then by the end of the first episode, he's a very old man. You know, even in the first episode, you know, we're talking to Rebecca, one of his former brides. I say that, a little bit of bile comes up in my mouth. But I mean, oh God, it's he wasn't as bad, I suppose, in that at least the girls were of legal age. Like, she was 19 when she married him, but he was 85. He was 85. And then there was another girl whose name evades me at the moment. He was 86 and she was 19 when they got married. So he was marrying right up until he died. He had 65 wives at the time of his death. And when he dies, well, kind of before that anyway, they're kind of sizing Warren, his son. He's not even the eldest son. He's just, they have this notion about him because he survived a premature birth, and his mother, you know, was kind of, I don't know, the Kris Kardashian or the Kris Jenner of her time, very much pushing him forward. And anyway, it's decided that he's the new Messiah, the new prophet, and then that he's going to take over from Rulon. And that's where things, if they weren't fucked up before, they really get fucked up. So we're into episode 2 then, and the kind of the new reality and the changes that happen under his dictatorship, really. You know, talk us through some of those changes, Kacey.
Yeah, so, you know, in the first episode where you come across, they introduced the Wall family originally, and I think it's Myrna Wall kind of talks about how she had her husband and they were high school sweethearts, and then this other woman is introduced and Myrna just kind of has to be okay with it.
Yeah,
and
crazy.
Lloyd goes on to talk about how he joined. I think he was a convert from the LDS faith to the FLDS faith, and he said that he was looking to create a better life for himself.
I bet he was.
I mean, I didn't know what to take from that, because and this is literally in the same breath, he says life was really good, but it was difficult having 2 women under the same roof. So I don't know what he really thinks about that situation. I don't know if he really believes that it was good or not.
I think he said we had 30 good years, and then the wife interjects and she goes, it was rocky, you know, so it was probably good for him. Yeah, probably good for him, and then shit for the women involved.
Yeah. But I guess my point is about just kind of highlighting that is a lot of the reason first generation members would have become involved in the FLDS church in the first place is because they would have been looking for something similar, you know, searching for something, whether that is a better life, whether, you know, polygamy aside, there was something attractive about the community, or they were, you know, they'd moved to the area and they're in that kind of transitional period where people are ripe for, you know, introduction to a high demand group, it's really important just to highlight that a lot of the time when people originally join these groups, that's the state of mind that they are in. They're searching for something, you know, whether that's help with grief from losing a loved one. And of course, speaking to the first generation members compared to the second and third and fourth, there's a big difference between the way that they are treated. And by the time we get up to Warren Jeffs taking over the FLDS church after his father has died, which left everybody confused because they truly believed that he couldn't die. Much like when L. Ron Hubbard died and everyone was like, and then David Miscavige had to give this big speech about how he's just left his vessel, which is his body. And now he's, you know, somewhere in the stratosphere, continuing his journey, and still, you know, guides David Miscavige to lead the Church of Scientology. So everybody was left really confused. Well, Warren Jeffs just kind of bullied his way into the headship of the FLDS church by asking the women underneath him who were submissive to him, because the opening quote of the actual documentary is, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." So, you know, it's not just everyone was subservient to Warren Jeffs. All of the women were subservient to the men, more so your husbands. And of course, the prophet at the top has the final say on everything.
And he was the favorite son of the prophet as well, whether it was stated, you know, anywhere in their Bible or whatever that he was going to be the new prophet. It didn't matter. He was the closest. And I suppose, you know, by that association, and they probably just needed someone. Like, I mean, if you're, God forgive me, but if you are used to spending your whole life going, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, you tell me what to do, you tell me what to wear, you tell me to wear, you actually can't make, and I mean, it's like an abusive relationship. It is an abusive relationship. You physically cannot make a single, you doubt yourself at every move, at every turn. So, I mean, they were probably, as I know he did bully himself in as well, but I'd say even if he hadn't have, there wouldn't have been a big lot of convincing he would have had to do. I'd say they would have been pretty willing to go with, whatever, as long as we don't have to think for ourselves, because we've never had to do it before.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. I mean, we see this a bit later on, which I'm sure we'll go back to. But what Warren does is he introduces, well, first of all, he says to some of his female followers, "Who do you think the next prophet is?"
Wink,
and of
wink.
course they say, "Well, I think it's you." You know, not only does he use that unwavering loyalty to position himself as, you know, so that already feels a bit like dictatorshipy. You know, he's not really given a chance for a vote. I'm not sure the result would have been any different, even if there was a vote. But, you know, for him to just kind of stand up and say, "I'm the new leader." I feel like that also might be a little bit like what David Miscavige did. But I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah.
I feel like he then just uses that momentum and ramps it up. So again, the fire and brimstone messages. And the biggest thing that Warren Jeffs does to make his tenure as leader of the FLDS church different to others is he establishes the commune down in Short Creek.
Because it says in the documentary that literally he got, you know, the business owners to sell their businesses, the homeowners to sell their homes, and then the church owned it. Like, if he wanted to split up a family, he would split up a family. If he wanted to take a wife and her kids and, you know, put them with another man and his wives and his kids, and he'd just literally go like, "This is your father now, your old father is dead." Like, this is the power he had in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, if you can convince people quite easily to give up what they own and actually probably not just keep that money for the move down to Short Creek, but also to give a large portion of that money to the church, then I think you can probably convince people to do anything. And I imagine that for some individuals, there's a line that they cross, and once they've crossed it, they probably think, well, yeah, I mean, I've given him all of my money and now he's asking for my wife. So, you know, why wouldn't I say no? Or he's asked for my wife and I didn't have a choice. So now he's asking me to sell, you know, my vehicles, of course, after you've said yes to something so significant, where does it end after that?
I think absolutely. And again, I'm going to draw that parallel between an abusive or controlling relationship, that thing of as well, if you've already invested so much in it, you don't want to look foolish. You don't want to look, you don't want to look stupid that even if you start to come to some kind of realization that, oh, maybe this person isn't the best person to be investing my time and energy in. If you've already invested so much time and energy, it can be very hard to walk away, because that is admitting as well to yourself that you've been fooled, that you've been conned, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that would be addressed as sunk cost fallacy by a lot of people who are deconstructing their experiences like post-cult.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's to save face. Sometimes it's because you've given all of your assets and all of your savings and everything to the church. So when you leave, where do you go? Sometimes you have so many children and so many partners involved in the group. How would you you'd have to convince all of them, or you have
Kacey,
to do what some of...
That was me. I was literally watching this and going, what would I have done in this situation?
Yeah.
Like, how can you leave? Like, imagine, I mean, I know that England and Ireland have a pretty similar kind of, social welfare, social services system, but like in America, it's a completely different ballgame. And like, I think it was Rebecca actually said at one point in it, she was like, I didn't know that there were such things as like women's shelters. I didn't know that there was somebody I could ring and they would come and they'd collect me. And then like, imagine, like you said, it's not just yourself, it's you plus, 10, 12, 15 kids that you've had biologically. And that's if you can get them out as well. And it's highly unlikely you can. It's, more often than not, when you're leaving, you're running by yourself, because it's an opportunity you've got and you need to move quick, and you can't drag, 15 kids behind you. But like, hypothetically speaking, right, even best case scenario, you got out with your 15 kids. I don't know why I'm on 15 now, but I'm running with it. You get out with your 15 kids. Who's going to pay for them? They don't have that structure whereby you can apply for, I know there is, but it's not as good as it would be in Britain or Ireland, whereby we would have a system whereby at least we can get some kind of social housing. We may not be loaded, but we'd have enough money to buy food. We would be given a lump sum to, do up the house if it wasn't habitable or whatever. There's all those kind of things in place over here that they wouldn't have had access to as well. And even if they did have access to it, they wouldn't have fucking known about it, because they were hidden away from the outside world their entire lives.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. There's so much to consider when a person is feeling like they need to leave a high demand group. And a lot of that comes down to shunning and in the way that we've just spoken about. If you leave, you lose your entire community, your entire family, everything you've ever known. One of the women in the documentary was talking about how she didn't know how to do her makeup. She didn't understand social references, fashion and clothing and culture. Those are all things that people who are second, third, fourth generation members that have lived in these insular communities have to learn brand new. So it's literally like starting from scratch and having to understand who you are separate to the group that you've been involved in since you were born, which is absolutely terrifying. I can't imagine how difficult that must be for somebody to have to literally leave a group and start from nothing. Just trying to make casual conversations with people. If somebody says, oh, did you watch that episode of Doctor Who last night? Who is what?
Yeah,
Doctor Who. So
it must be like getting dropped on like an alien planet.
Yeah.
And just
not understanding the language.
Yeah.
All of that stuff. Yeah, absolutely. So fear keeps people in, sunk cost fallacy keeps people in, guilt and shame keeps people in, consequences of leaving. Again, I mean, I know that kind of is encapsulated in the fear that we've already talked about. But there's a lot of different reasons why somebody, might not just leave, because that's a question people ask me a lot, when I'm discussing the podcast and the show and the work that I do. Why do people join and why don't they just leave? Those two questions are so difficult to answer, and there's so many misconceptions around those things. What this documentary does is paints a really good kind of picture to people on the outside to explain to them, why these people can't just walk away.
Yeah, and actually, when you're talking about that as well, it's a nice little bridge to what I was going to bring up next, and that's I think in every documentary you watch, every film you watch, everything you watch, there'll always be someone who your heart just goes out to for whatever reason. You see a bit of yourself in them, or maybe your own story, or there's a similarity there. But in this, for me, and she was only introduced in episode 2, and I don't know, there was something about her, Ruby. So Ruby is talking about, she was one of the girls who was married off when she was 14. So this is under Warren's, dictatorship. Herself and the other girl, Alyssa, Rebecca's younger sister, they're brought to that motel. So it's kind of like on the border of a state where, it's okay, it's not legal anywhere for underage marriage, but I think it's, kind of brushed under the rug. So they go to this motel and they're married off. But she's talking about how before that, she develops a crush on this boy. And so they have this, and she's only 14. So she has this, telephone romance, like landline romance, because there was no mobile phones, with this other guy within the FLDS. And they talk about like they got married and had kids and and then she's told at 14 she has to marry. It's a second cousin of hers, actually, I think she said. And then she's talking about the marriage and that. And then she actually is so unhappy. She's going to Warren Jeffs. She's saying, please let me out of this marriage. This wasn't meant to be, yada, yada, yada. It's fallen on deaf ears. She runs away. And then Warren Jeffs actually uses the boy that she had the crush on to get her back in. So he rings the guy. I think his name is Joe. I'm going to go with Joe. He rings Joe and he's like, look, Ruby's after escaping. If you bring her back, I'll let you guys get married. And so Joe goes to her, gets her, and she's already out at this stage. She has like moved in with other former church members who've also, either been shunned or, been thrown out or whatever. And he brings her back. And then Warren not only lets them not get married, but he actually shuns Joe out of the community completely and says, that's it, you can't come back in. And then I remember she said, that's when I was 14. And by the time I was 24, I had 6 kids. And while I love them all, none of them were by choice. And there was something about that that just broke my heart. Absolutely broke my heart. To think that she had probably what most, what 2 or 3 women would have in a lifetime in terms of children, she had by the age of 24. And then that seemed to be their modus operandi. If there was a girl with independent thought, that's how they operated. They got her married young and they got her pregnant. It's insane, isn't it?
Why do you think it was this particular individual that Warren put so much into getting her back into the church?
I think because she was underage, obviously if she spoke to law enforcement, they would have, it'd just be a clusterfuck, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's necessarily that she was, I think he saw before the marriage and before the kids, I think he saw the potential for trouble. Like she was outspoken, she had a little bit of fire in her and that was dangerous.
Maybe that's why you connected with
maybe that's what Jesus, yeah. Maybe that's why I connected with her. Yeah, I've never been one to toe the line, I suppose. But and I suppose as well, I was a young mum myself. Maybe that's what it comes down to as well. Not as young as her, obviously, but there was an element of that as well. But yeah, definitely. Like, and it's funny again that you say that. Like, why did I think that that's why he tried to get her in so vehemently? Because obviously that's what ultimately ends up being his undoing, is these child brides, right?
Yeah, and that's where the big difference is, I think. What I really liked about that documentary was that you had both perspectives. So you had the 2 individuals in the telephone relationship discussing actually their sides of the story, which lined up perfectly, because a lot of the time there's space left in these documentaries for people to say, well, did that actually happen? I think it's pretty much indisputable at this point, considering, the different directions their lives took after his shunning from the church. But that's exactly what happened. And I think you're right. I think Warren Jeffs put more effort into retrieving her and placing her back under his control because she was underage. It wasn't just the fire and brimstone doomsday messages that Warren Jeffs introduced. It wasn't just the big move down to Short Creek, which was a community that they literally built out of nothing, which we've seen in Wild Wild Country with one Sri Rajneesh. We have also seen Warren Jeffs start to introduce child brides. So when they do go for their marriage ceremonies at this dingy motel, which is obviously not where anybody ever pictures themselves getting married, you know, not even thinking about the young kids who probably just don't even understand really what the concept of marriage is at that point. You know, so many of the women were like, you know, I'm supposed to have sex with him now. I don't even know what that means, you know. So sex and relationship education inside Heidemann religion groups is like a whole conversation in itself. But just on this point, you know, the biggest thing that Warren Jeffs appeared to have done that Rulon didn't do, but I guess we don't really know, was introduce child brides into the FLDS movement at this stage. And when people are like, hey, I'm searching for something in my life, if that person's a predator, if they're looking for access, easy access to vulnerable children, you know, it's just going to sound like a dream come true to them when they say, do you know what? Inside this community, you can marry a 14-year-old girl.
Yeah.
And you're encouraged to have a quiverful family with her. So, you know, all of the women are encouraged to have as many kids as possible. And it all feeds into the agenda of the group. So the men are supposed to marry multiple women. The women are supposed to bear multiple children. Those children are the currency of the realm. They are used to gain favor, to gain power, to gain status and reputation in the Short Creek area where Warren Jeffs had relocated his community. The female children were the currency of the FLDS church, which in itself, like, you can't see my arms, but like it's just, yeah. And that's why the documentary is even being questioned as fiction by some people who have never heard of the FLDS church. You go online and they say, this isn't real. It's real.
It's so funny you said that.
It's so funny you said that, because after I watched it, when I was doing my bits of research, when I put in keep sweet, pray and obey, it like autofilled, is this real or is it? It was crazy. Like, yeah, like that. I suppose I had knowledge of it because obviously I had read the book donkeys years ago, probably nearly 20 years ago now, given my age. And like, obviously this is your jam. This is what you do all day, every day. So you would have had knowledge of it. But we forget, I suppose, that there was a great percentage of the population out there who are hearing about this for the first time, which is great in one sense, because that's exactly what needs to happen. We need to educate people about what's going on in the world and how easy it is. You know, it's not some Egypt. Like, it's so easy to be conned. And that effectively what it is. It's a con. It starts out as something else, as you said, with the first generation. And then by the second, third generation, it's a whole other different ball game. And how the hell do you get out then? When your grandparents, your mum and dad, aunts, uncles, everybody you've ever known, the only life you've ever known is in that community.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the education that everybody receives, the homeschool curriculum education. I speak about this a lot on the show with former members of extreme fundamentalist groups and homeschooling programs like the Advanced Training Institute and Bill Gothard's Institute for Basic Life Principles and you know, fundamentalist groups where if the women stay in these environments and teach the kids, and then the kids grow up to be mothers and fathers who stay home and teach the kids, and nobody is having experiences outside of this community, how are they even supposed to know what exists 5 minutes down the road from them? You know, what the world looks like. Textbooks will have pages ripped out of them if they refer to anything to do with evolution, anything to do with the Big Bang, anything that does not in keep with Mormon rhetoric, I imagine, is taken out of textbooks, as it is with a lot of high-demand religious groups and into communities like this one. And if you were to up and leave, you might have a birth certificate that has a false birth father's name on it.
Yeah.
And so I imagine none of these people have passports, apart from the ones that they are sending internationally to do missionary work, which is basically human trafficking. Well, it is human trafficking, which is one of the most devastating elements of plural marriage and polygamy that is absolutely not highlighted anywhere near enough in this documentary. And they left out so much about the lost boys within the FLDS church, and there should have been a whole episode dedicated towards literally just highlighting what happens to the boys within these movements, because the powerful men within the hierarchy that have their status and position established for whatever reason in the church, whether they're a judge or a police officer, or whether they have significant income which they give to the church, whatever it is that they bring to the church, they can just keep having wives added to their quiver.
Yeah.
The boys that are born from these quiverful plural marriages, say someone has 20 kids and 6 of them are boys, they're not worth anything in the FLDS church. The currency of the realm, as we said, was young girls. So what they do with these boys, and this is just hideous, is they just send them out to do construction work in other parts of the country and slave labor, where they send back all of that money to the FLDS church, where they are supposed to go out and do missionary work and talk about the FLDS church and what they offer, and convert people and recruit people, or they're sent internationally.
And that's what Joe was doing. I could be using the wrong name, but that's exactly what had happened to Ruby's.
Yeah, they don't want them around.
No, he was sent off to do missionary work in inverted commas, and then called back to get her back into church, get her back into clutches, and then told to feck off.
So that was something I felt was lacking from the documentary itself, talking about the lost boys of the FLDS church as a subject, because there are, as you can imagine, thousands of these children who are basically just tossed out by the wayside, where everybody else is confined in these environments. It's hideous.
It doesn't seem like it can, but it goes from bad to worse. So I suppose it starts to unravel when he starts to build this ranch, Zion. So obviously they're taught in their teachings about Zion. It's, their heaven of sorts, but then he starts changing the teachings, as they often do, I suppose, when, to fit their own rhetoric. And so he changes it and he goes, actually, do you know what? Heaven is, to quote a song, heaven is a place on earth. So it's not actually heaven up in the clouds. It is a place on earth. It's this place called Zion, and it does exist. And this is when he starts building this ranch. And yeah, look, I'll let you take it from here. It's a wild one.
Yeah. First of all, I'm not sure if Texas was the right place for him to choose for this community, because when you look at fundamentalism and evangelicalism, when you look at Christian nationalism and dominionism and these subjects, and this is kind of getting slightly more into the religious theological side of things. Anybody that's tuning into the Roe versus Wade debates and discussions, and whether they're going to overturn that ruling, Texas is potentially a religious state, which within the amendment isn't actually allowed to exist. It says in the amendment that people are free to practice their own religion, but no state can be one religious state. So, like you see in Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale, that's not allowed to exist. You're not allowed to have one religious state. In that state, if you're a fundamentalist Christian, you're also allowed to convert to Buddhism.
Yeah.
In the amendment. Of course, that's not how these insular communities work, and maybe not how Texas is actually working at the moment, but we don't really know because we're not there. So a lot of people will argue that that's just what the media wants you to know.
Yeah.
The left-wing media or whatever. That's not the debate that I'm trying to have. The point that I'm trying to make in a really long-winded way is that taking your FLDS polygamist group over to Texas where these Christian nationalists live is maybe not the best idea.
Well, it's going to draw attention to you anyway, right?
Yeah, it's going to draw attention.
Yeah.
We saw
And it
earlier in the documentary that there were police officers who were like, yeah, we know, that plural marriage is happening, the polygamy is happening. And they're like, well, are you going to do anything about it? And he's like, no, actually, I need you to leave the property, kind of protecting Warren Jeffs at that point. And you're like, well, what can we do if law enforcement are involved in this? And then how high does it go? But when Warren Jeffs goes over to Texas, which is uncharted territory for him and his group at that point, at this level, with this size, all bets are off the table when it comes to how far does his influence go? How many people does he have involved? Because there'll be prominent figures. It always comes down to agenda. So there'll be prominent figures in Texas who are looking to be re-elected, who are looking to be in for another term, who are looking to be elected sheriff. Whatever it is that's happening at that point, people will be looking at what they can do to further their own agenda. So when Warren Jeffs comes to town, everybody's like, do you know what? This is exactly what's going to get me to that next place. And that's what happens, as the documentary unfolds. It goes from people catching wind about potential child abuse and forced marriages of underage girls, and the documentary just kind of unravels from there.
He is eventually caught. He's caught because he's on the run at this point, because we've kind of skipped over it, but we can't talk about every element of the documentary either. His one of his followers, who is also a police officer, is done for statutory rape because he's got a child bride. She's 14 and she's pregnant. She's had the child already by the time it goes to court. So he's prosecuted now. They say in the documentary it's literally a slap on the wrist, but it doesn't matter. What it does is it shows Jeffs that he's not invincible and that they are going to start prosecuting this shite if they get wind of it. So he goes on the run. He is caught. And then again, I'm skipping ahead, but we can't talk of every, 45, 46 minutes of the four episodes. But when he's in jail, they then solicit the help of his former victims because they need to find the information that's going to absolutely put him away for donkey's years. And so they gain access to the ranch. In the meantime, he has been shipping, you were talking about that human trafficking element. He's been shipping not just underage, girls, they are babies. He's literally, they're babies, toddlers, young kids, all the way up to kind of, what might be the legal age. I mean, they're young kids. Yeah. I think there's 400 when they finally, get into the ranch. Of these kids are taken from Short Creek, from their families, and put into this ranch. And it's just his kind of, his own little playground, isn't it? It's his own.
Yeah, it's interesting how the documentary positioned that unfolding. Of course, we don't know if it's actually how it happened.
Yeah.
But it felt like it made a lot of sense. So this community that he'd built in Texas, Zion, was more insular than Short Creek was.
Mm-hmm. If you can believe that.
Yeah, it absolutely wild how he was even able to kind of, and there is a reason that all of this would have unraveled as well. So not only was there a dress code, on expectations and how people were supposed to dress modestly, covering up your shoulders all the way down to your ankles, there was also then only a certain set of pastel colors that women could wear. And then Warren Jeffs starts to ramp up his punishments and public shaming. So what you see here is after this police officer is arrested, Warren Jeffs' paranoia level is just through the roof.
Yeah.
He gets his 20 most prominent male figures that follow him at that point in a room with all of his followers at Zion and basically starts publicly shaming them, starts saying that they are not the followers that they should be. How dare they question the prophet? And he basically flexes all of the control and power that he has, because he needs to feel like he's still in control. So he takes these 20 members of the church that have followed him and done everything he's ever asked, breaks up all of their marriages, pairs these people with new women, and all of their children are never allowed to see their fathers again. Some of the men are kicked out of the church. I think his brother was one of them, kicked out of the church, like indefinitely.
Leroy, wasn't it? Yeah, the brother.
And so you see here, just you can see this with Charles Manson when he takes his followers out to Death Valley. You can see this with Jim Jones when he takes his followers all the way over to Guyana. You can see it with Rock Terrio and the Anthill Kids when he takes his followers all the way to these woods in the middle of nowhere, where they literally have like no toilets, no power, no housing. They have to build everything from scratch. You know, we've seen this again and again and again with these different groups. Warren Jeffs is doing exactly the same thing. His paranoia is ramping up. He feels like he's losing control, and his grip on his followers just gets even harsher. And then he starts telling people adultery was something that you could not come back from, right? So these men can have multiple women married to them, and they can have a line that goes on for hours outside their bedroom door, where they have every single wife come and kiss them goodnight. And as soon as a woman has a relationship with somebody outside of her marriage, you know, a plural partner, a second partner, she is shunned or disfellowed or disfellowshipped for cardinal sins. And that to me is, again, it's just power over women. Women have no autonomy. They have no say. When it comes to the sex and relationship stuff, there was not enough education, even with the men, even if the men didn't want to harm the women, to understand what consent is, to understand how to arouse a woman so that it's not painful for her to have sexual intercourse. You know, none of the women understood what was happening to them. Then the children were being impregnated, and that's not even like something I can like comprehend. But you can see that Warren Jeffs is unraveling as soon as this police officer is arrested, and he takes it out on his most loyal followers, which you often find in these insular communities is what will happen. And then eventually he is caught by the feds, and you know, after being on the most wanted list. And as you say, you know, human trafficking of babies, but also people running him money across the country so that he can. And this was the most interesting part, I guess, of the documentary for me personally. I don't know how much access to the outside world Warren Jeffs had prior to his going on the run. But he was living the high life in a way that felt like a kid in a candy store. Like, wow, I've never experienced porn, so I'm just going to watch it with all my wives. And I've never been to a football game, so I'm gonna drink all these beers at a football game. He was like, it was like he'd been released into, you know, Disneyland. He didn't.
I think he knew his time was.
Do you think? Yeah,
his
maybe.
days were numbered as well. I do think he knew that the jig was up. He knew that, you know, that the net was closing in, and that he was like, fuck it, if I'm going to go down, I'm, you know, literally, like, what came to my mind watching the documentary was like the Nazis, like Hitler, that, you know, the way they said in the final week of Auschwitz, he killed more Jews and Poles and Gypsies than he had in the previous 18 months. Imagine, because he knew. So he was like on overdrive trying to get, you know, every last drip out of this. I feel like that's what it was as well.
Yeah. And I think that too would make sense. He was originally charged for accomplice to rape, I believe, statutory rape.
That's right.
And then as they gathered more evidence, as you said, and they you know, stormed the ranch and found more evidence, you know, to lock him away for a long time. Those women that came forward with their testimonies and spoke out about him, I think it can't be underestimated the strength it would take to do that, because we've already talked about how difficult it would be to leave your community, but to speak out against your community as well is really kind of sealing the deal on you never really having communication with them until those individuals themselves are ready to leave that group. And you're on the outside waiting for them. You know, I think it was Becky, once one of her sisters or maybe even daughters had finally decided to leave, she was like, I am here and I will talk you through how we do this together. So that's all you can do really for somebody that's leaving a cult or a high demand group, is be as completely non-judgmental as possible and just say like, I am here. The kind of repercussions that those women faced for speaking out publicly about Warren Jeffs was absolutely terrifying. I imagine they feared for their lives.
Absolutely. And I mean, they would have had justifiable reason to fear for their lives as well, because as you said, every element of their lives were policed. There was, I think at one stage they talked about, was it the pigeon's nest, or this was the room where they had all the CCTV camera, like everywhere was rigged with cameras. They would zoom in and see if you were praying or if you were, just if you were smiling, if you looked like, you were, a devoted follower or not. I suppose as well, it's worth mentioning at this point, this part did surprise me, because obviously I read that book however many years ago, and I haven't really dipped my toe back into the FLDS world since. I haven't read anything on it. I've seen headlines, and obviously when all of that came about, I saw the headlines. I didn't really ever look into it in any great depth again. And I suppose this is the warning we should give about this documentary. It doesn't really hold back in terms of what they found when they did eventually storm the ranch. I wasn't even aware of this. It's just that I think we all do it. We compartmentalize. So obviously I'd read the book. I knew there was child brides, but I was like, okay. And the story ends there. When they go to the ranch, then they find recordings of, like you said, this kind of fucking Gilead shit going on, where there's like an altar that's a bed, these religious ceremonies being held in front of people where they are giving themselves up to art. There's recordings of them, and it's just horrific. It's just horrific. It's even though in your minds, your heart of your heart, so you might know that's where it's going. I think to hear it, to see it, in terms of like, you don't see obviously anything happening, but you do see an altar, you see that kind of bed thing that he has constructed. I found that so shocking, even though, I'm an educated woman, I like to think. And like I said, I knew that was going on in terms of child brides. Yeah. But then I don't know, there's something about that. It's so much darker. These are kids, girls that have been, like we said, they've been torn from their families. They've been brought to this isolated ranch. Yeah. It is his own private Zion, is what it is. It's his own fucked up, fantasy is what he makes it. But on the flip of that, it is unfortunate that it had to get to that level, but that is the shit that really nails him, isn't it, Kacey?
Yeah, it is. That's the evidence that they were looking for. And you can draw parallels again with Nexium and how Keith Raniere had DOS, which was kind of like a group working on the inside of Nexium, where women were branding themselves and being sex trafficked. And Keith Raniere himself was using these women for his own sexual pleasure, collecting collateral on the women so that they couldn't leave, and they would have to pledge themselves to him in a similar way. Of course, we're not talking about children, although there was explicit material of children found on Keith Raniere's hard drive. So again, more parallels between the material that they found in this white room, in this basically room where ritualistic sexual abuse took place. That is really what seals it for Warren Jeffs. But I feel like it kind of, if you start on the bigger picture, where you think about high demand religious group, questionable cult-like activities taking place with Rulon, really kind of getting severe with Warren. And then he's like, okay, more plural marriages, insular community. How about we start marrying off children to adult men? And then how about I start performing these rituals in my bedroom? So it was really like, how far can he take it? He really probably bought into his own rhetoric that he was a prophet and he could do what he wanted with anybody he wanted, and anything that would fulfill his ever inflating ego, he just seemed to do and that eventually tragically included the rape of multiple children, which you can hear over this videotape. So I guess that's another thing that might have made people question whether this was real or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's very real. The FLDS church still exists, as we saw at the end of the documentary.
Yeah.
It's still ongoing. This particular branch of the FLDS church are still taking leadership sermons, instructions from Warren Jeffs from prison. It's very similar to David Berg and the Children of God. He went on the run. He started covering up his face. He would release Mo letters because he called himself Moses, so another self-proclaimed prophet who created these communes all over the world, another human trafficking ring where all of the money seemingly went back to him to fuel his escapades around the world so that he could, not get caught by police. They stopped releasing pictures of his face until he died. David Berg, very similar in a lot of ways to Warren Jeffs, with the children intergenerational love, they called it, which was just basically, sex with a child, which he condoned and actually encouraged. The flirty fishing came first, where it was like he would basically whores for Jesus, he called them. He would pimp out his devoted female followers to go and have sex with men because a woman's body was, there's only one language certain men can read, or there's only one Bible a certain type of man will read. And he would write these in his Mo letters and send them out to people. So the flirty fishing came first, then the intergenerational relationships came next, and then he would be photographed with his own children that he'd married. These hand-picked children that he decided, second and third and fourth generation Children of God members were sacred because they were born, within the group. So many parallels between David Berg and Warren Jeffs. And you kind of wonder at some point, do they all just take notes out of each other's handbooks? Or how do these situations get to the point where white rooms exist and men are recording themselves having these interactions?
I think it's a case of, pedophiles will always find a way, whether it be I'm a cult leader, I'm a priest, I'm a swim coach, I'm thinking of all the documentaries I've watched recently. They will always find a way where they're, to some degree, some more than others, obviously with cult leaders, but they'll find themselves in a position of power over kids, where they can have great influence.
Exploit that position to the fullest.
Absolutely. Would you recommend this documentary? Did you enjoy it? Again, I use that term in inverted commas.
Yeah, so my biggest takeaway, I guess, from the case, first of all, just one small point I wanted to make before we wrap up. You mentioned earlier that it's similar to abusive relationships and domestic violence. One-on-one cults absolutely exist. So people that are experiencing domestic abuse and domestic violence, I imagine if you were to read a lot of resources around cult recovery, there'd be a lot of terminology in that that study material that you could actually apply to your own situation. And sometimes the first basis of recovering from one of these situations or understanding it is being able to put a name to the types of abuses that you are experiencing. So one-on-one cults absolutely exist in domestic relationships. And the biggest takeaway for me from this documentary, and a few things that have irked me online, a lot of people who consider themselves well-versed in the subject of cults and cult studies have been saying, yeah, it's a good documentary, but it's nothing I haven't seen before. You can read all about this stuff.
That's so dismissive.
You can hear the tapes. You can read all of the arrest reports. I agree that material is all out there, but Netflix as a streaming platform has a huge database of people that access their documentaries. So it cannot be underestimated, the reach that this subject will have on new,
like for new generations. There's always going to be a new, like, it's funny you say that, Kacey. I had the exact same argument. I remember when I think it was season 1 or season 2, I reviewed the documentary Casting John Bonet, which, if you've never seen it, on Netflix, cracking documentary, really unique take on a story as well. But again, when I released that episode, I will forever remember, in one of the true crime groups that I'm in, somebody commented and said, you know, oh my God, not this case again. Could you not have thought of anything original? And I said, like, what? That's such an elitist thing to say. Like, just because people have covered a case before, there's always going to be people who won't have heard of a case. And I'm sure from, you know, victims, survivors, their families' point of view, they want it to be screamed from the rooftops, not just shouted, screamed, because you have to be aware there's always a generation that hasn't heard about it. And there's always a generation that can be affected by it, that can become victims of that type of behavior. Maybe not that specific cult or that specific killer, but knowledge is power. So I'm always baffled when people say, like, oh, it's nothing new. Yeah, we're not saying it's something new, but what we're saying is the information may not be new, but yet it can happen again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And here's another way it can happen.
Absolutely right. Yeah, there's millions of people that use Netflix, and the audiences that this documentary will be reaching that may never have heard of the FLDS Church before, or even high demand religious groups that might even be able to recognize that someone that they know is involved in one of these communities. You know, and then also people might go on to research more. People might, you know, and then have conversations with other people that have never heard of this. So it should not be underestimated, the reach that this documentary will have, even if the information being covered is information that was already available to the public. And I think that is my biggest giveaway from this documentary. I think it was well done. I think it was well put together. I think it covers a lot. There is a lot that's missed out. All in all, really happy with the documentary.
And do you know what? That seems to be the resounding feeling online as well, because it got 91% on Rotten Tomatoes, which, again, you know, Rotten Tomatoes and kind of IMDb are the go-to in terms of critiquing these things or getting ratings. And then on IMDb as well, it got like 7.65, which might sound shocking, but anyone who knows this documentary and or this podcast and listens to me knows that, you know, IMDb historically, they really, really mark hard when it comes to true crime documentaries. You will rarely get above a 7. So to get nearly an 8 is unheard of. So it's been, you know, very well received by the public and by critics alike online. And I think, like what you said, it's in part the fact that obviously it's just this really compelling story, but then also it is this Netflix, you know, just have a way of, you know, polishing a documentary, hitting the really, really important parts of the narrative. I know, as you said, there's so many important parts that are missed out on as well, but they can get all of the segments in that are needed to keep a story cohesive and still deliver it in, you know, 3-4 kind of hour-long episodes or 45-minute episodes, as it is in this case. I think is quite a feat in itself. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed it too. I really did. And like I said, it just kind of brought me back to that book I read all those years ago and went, holy shit, I can't believe this shit is still going on. Kacey, while you're here, look, plug all of your socials. Tell us where we can follow you.
Yes, so you can find me at Cobalt Pod on all social medias. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I'm on Reddit. You can find me on YouTube. I'm starting to release a few more videos on there at the moment. You can find me on all podcast platforms under the Cult Vault. If you're less interested in hearing 3 to 4 hour long Survivor interviews, I mean, I could never not be interested. That's like absolutely my thing. If you're more interested in the deep dive stuff, then I do one exclusive episode on an infamous cult each month on Patreon. And there's like a ton of ad-free content on there and loads of perks for the patrons that are involved over there at the moment. You know, not to sound too culty, you know, I've got my little Patreon group.
Look, thanks so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and absolutely, we'll do that again.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, Gemma.
Guys, I hope you enjoyed the episode with Kacey. Remember, if you like what I do, everything I provide here at What's Up Doc Podcast is free of charge. All I ask is that you support. The easiest way to do that, obviously, is go straight on over to Apple Podcasts, give me a 5-star review, rating, I should say. Give me a review as well if you'd like. I love to get the feedback there. Give us a like and a rating on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. It's all graciously appreciated. What you can do as well is, I don't really provide Patreon content. I just don't have time with working full time as well. But if you'd like to support me further through Patreon, you have an option of buying me a coffee. €3, won't break the bank, and I'm fueled on coffee, so it keeps me going while I'm ticking over and doing What's Up Doc. That's all the time we have for again this week. Show us some love online. Share it if you've listened to it. That's all we've got time for, guys. Good luck. Good night. God bless.
Hello everybody, I'm Ross and What's the Crack?
And I'm Rob, and this is our podcast, I Understood That Reference.
We cover all corners of the pop culture spectrum, including movies, comics, which is my favourite, games, and everything in between.
With our own unique mix of games, trivia, a little insight, all wrapped up in Irish accents.
And of course, the tin whistle.
So get up them stairs and download this podcast into your ears.
I'm Ross.
And I'm Rob.
And this has been I Understood That Reference. Available on Spotify, SoundCloud, Podchaser, and wherever else decent podcasts are available.
Yay!
Something is creeping in, don't follow it down.
Let me introduce you to Barry Clew, an authorised financial advisor from New Zealand and a very special kind of stain on humanity.
He was a very knowledgeable young guy.
He was a registered financial advisor.
Type of guy that was bending over backwards to help you.
Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that Barry sounds like a great guy, and you'd be right. Well, right up until the point when you're wrong.
It was all fictitious.
She stole from my son who has a disability.
Chris never knew. He died believing that we're all taken care of.
A psychopath is somebody who lacks empathy, acts impulsively. I think there's a strong case that Barry might be all of those things, actually.
To find out how Barry Clew stole over $15 million from 81 victims, subscribe to Clueless, The Long Con. That's Clueless, spelt Klooghless.